On a quiet morning in a small town, an elderly woman dropped her trash bag when her hands began to shake. Instead of offering help, a young police officer barked at her and threatened a fine. A black man passing by stepped in to defend her, only to be met with racial insults and handcuffs. What the officer never imagined was that his target was a retired FBI director, and that this one act would cost him everything. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The golden light of a late autumn morning spilled across the quiet streets of Brooksville, a small town that prided itself on knowing the name of every neighbor. The air carried the faint scent of fallen maple leaves, crisp and earthy, while the trees lining both sides of the street stood like patient guardians, their leaves blazing in shades of gold and copper. It was a Saturday, the kind of morning where nothing seemed in a hurry. Dogs padded lazily beside their owners, children wobbled by on bikes, and the hum of distant lawnmowers blended with the occasional call of a blue jay. Marcus Johnson stepped out of his modest brick home, closing the black iron gate with the same deliberate care he used to show when locking up evidence in his old FBI office. At 65, his stride was slower but still steady, each step purposeful. His tall frame was dressed neatly, pressed slacks, a navy sweater over a crisp white shirt because even in retirement, Marcus believed in showing the world a man's respect for himself. His face carried the kind of calm only years of confronting chaos could carve into a man, but his eyes, they were watchful, always scanning, as if reading the air for things most people couldn't see. He walked with his hands tucked into his pockets, nodding warmly to a young mother pushing a stroller. She smiled, calling out, "Morning, Mr. Johnson," her voice carrying a kind of reverence. Everyone here knew him, though few knew the full extent of his past, how he had once stood at the helm of the nation's most powerful investigative agency, how he had looked into the eyes of dangerous men without flinching. Now he was simply Marcus, the quiet neighbor who watered his lawn at the same time every evening and carried groceries for the elderly without being asked. Just 2 houses down, a pale blue front door creaked open. Out stepped Edith Brown, 78 years old, wearing a wool cardigan the color of oatmeal, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She paused on her porch, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching a canvas tote. Marcus noticed her immediately. He always did. "Morning, Miss Edith," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the crisp air. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed to cost her a little effort these days. "Morning, Marcus," she replied, her voice thin but warm. Marcus slowed his pace and angled toward her house, the habit of checking in on her as natural as breathing. Since moving back to Brooksville 5 years ago, he had learned her rhythms, the way she liked her milk cold, her newspapers on the porch by 7 a.m., her preference for seedless grapes over the green ones with pits. He had also learned how fiercely she valued her independence, even as her hands trembled more each year. "Need a hand with that bag?" he asked, eyeing the tote that seemed too heavy for her narrow shoulders. She shook her head gently. "Just going through some old papers," she said, though Marcus noticed the faint pull in her expression, the way her eyes flicked toward the street, as if measuring the distance she could walk today. They talked for a few minutes, their conversation an easy exchange of neighborly updates, how the Hendersons' dog had gotten loose again, how the leaves this year seemed more brilliant than last. Yet beneath the surface of their words was something unspoken, a quiet thread of mutual trust. For Edith, Marcus wasn't just a neighbor, he was a silent assurance that if anything went wrong someone would be there. For Marcus, Edith was a reminder of why he had come back, to protect the small human moments that so often went unnoticed in a city, to keep watch not over criminals now, but over the people who made life worth living. As they parted, Marcus continued his walk, his shoes crunching over the thin scatter of leaves on the sidewalk. The sun warmed his shoulders, but his mind remained alert. The street was calm, yet somewhere deep inside, he carried the sense that calm was never permanent. Not in his world. The quiet beauty of Brooksville was something to be guarded, and Marcus Johnson had not forgotten how. He glanced back once toward Edith's house. She was still on the porch, adjusting the tote on her arm, her thin frame outlined against the pale blue door. Something about the way her hand lingered on the railing caught his attention, a subtle tremor, a small sign that life here, no matter how peaceful, could shift in a heartbeat. Marcus kept walking, but in the back of his mind, the former director in him was already making note. Some mornings carried more weight than they appeared to. This one, though no one knew it yet, would be one of them. The autumn air was still carrying that golden warmth when Marcus reached the corner of Maple and Fifth, the spot where the town's communal trash bins sat behind a low wooden fence. It was usually a place of no consequence, just part of the Saturday morning rhythm, residents dropping off bags before heading to the diner or the farmer's market. But as Marcus approached, he noticed Edith moving slowly down the sidewalk, her tote now replaced by a black plastic trash bag that sagged heavy in her thin hands. She shuffled carefully toward the bins, her breath visible in the crisp air, her shoulders curved forward against the slight breeze. Marcus was still 20 yards away when it happened. Edith reached the fence, lifted the lid of the nearest bin with her right hand, and as she tried to swing the bag up, her left hand trembled violently. The bag slipped from her grip, hitting the ground with a dull thud before splitting open along the seam. Banana peels, crumpled newspapers, and coffee grounds spilled out, scattering across the damp pavement. For a moment, she just stared at the mess, her lips pressing into a thin line, the kind of expression people make when they are deciding whether to bend down or just let it go. That moment didn't last. A sharp voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The sound was abrupt, jarring against the gentle quiet of the morning. From around the corner came Officer Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, his patrol car idling just out of sight. His uniform was crisp, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the sunlight, and his stride was quick, almost aggressive, as he closed the distance between himself and Edith. "You can't just dump garbage wherever you feel like," he barked, stopping only a few feet from her. Edith's head jerked up, her eyes wide. "I didn't mean to, my hands," she began, her voice shaking. "Don't start with excuses," Miller interrupted, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You're going to pick this up, all of it, right now, with your hands." His voice carried loudly, bouncing off the brick walls of the nearby buildings. A couple walking their dog slowed down, glancing toward the commotion. Edith's gaze darted to the ground, then to her frail hands. "I can't without gloves," she tried to explain, but Miller took a step closer, the shadow of his frame falling across hers. "Ma'am, you either clean this up, or I take you down to the station and write you a citation, your choice." His voice was flat now, cold in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Marcus had reached the edge of the scene by then, his pace slowing as he took in the sight of Edith, small, vulnerable, backed up against the fence, and Miller, looming over her with an authority that felt less like order and more like intimidation. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus's voice was calm but carried the weight of someone used to being heard. Miller turned his head sharply toward him, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Keep moving." Marcus took another step forward, his eyes steady on Miller. "That's my neighbor," he said evenly, "and it looks to me like she dropped that bag by accident. You can ask her instead of barking orders at her." Miller's lips curled in a faint smirk. "I don't need a lecture on how to do my job. Especially not from." He paused, his tone shifting slightly, his gaze flicking over Marcus's dark skin before settling back on his face. "Someone who's decided to insert himself into something that isn't his business." The words hung there, thick with unspoken implication. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same kind of tension he had faced too many times before, moments when authority was wielded like a weapon, sharpened by prejudice. "It is my business when you're talking to her like that," Marcus replied, his voice still measured but edged now with steel. "She's an elderly woman, she doesn't need to be threatened over a spilled bag of trash." Edith looked between them, her hands trembling, not just from age now, but from the rising tension. The couple with the dog had stopped entirely, standing a short distance away, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Miller's jaw flexed, his posture squaring. "Sir, I'm going to tell you one last time, step away. You're interfering with an officer in the course of his duties." "I'm not interfering," Marcus said, holding Miller's gaze. "I'm asking you to show some respect. That's part of your duty too." Miller's nostrils flared, and in that instant, something in his stance shifted from verbal warning to physical escalation. He reached down to his belt, his hand closing around the cold metal of his handcuffs. The sound of them clicking open was sharp, final. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered. The dog walker gasped quietly. Edith's voice cracked as she tried to step forward. "Please, he hasn't done anything." "Ma'am, stay back," Miller barked at her without turning, his eyes locked on Marcus. The sunlight caught the edge of his sunglasses, making his expression harder to read, but his tone carried an unmistakable edge of hostility. Marcus didn't move immediately. He studied Miller, his mind weighing the balance between compliance and the dignity he refused to surrender. The street had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that builds before a storm. Marcus could feel every eye on them now, the weight of the moment pressing in. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice low but firm. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Miller's grip on the cuffs tightened. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can mouth off to me and walk away." The air between them was taut, stretched to its breaking point. Marcus knew this wasn't just about trash or even about him. It was about the kind of authority that expected obedience without question. And what happened when someone stood in its way? Edith's eyes glistened with tears, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the fence for support. The couple with the dog shifted uncomfortably, but didn't leave, their faces drawn with the uneasy knowledge that they were witnessing something that wasn't going to end gently. Miller took a step forward, closing the gap until he was within arm's reach of Marcus. The metallic glint of the cuffs caught the sunlight again, a cold reminder of the power he was prepared to use. Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The calm of the morning was gone, replaced by something volatile, unpredictable. He kept his voice steady, but inside, the old instincts he thought he'd left behind were stirring, warning him that this was only the beginning. Miller's hand shot forward, the steel cuffs closing around Marcus's wrists with a metallic snap that echoed louder than it should have in the open air. The cold bite of the metal settled against Marcus's skin, not from the temperature but from the indignity of it. His back straightened instinctively, shoulders squaring, though the weight of years in law enforcement told him there was no dignity in a public arrest, only the silent calculation of what came next. Around them the small crowd that had gathered was no longer just watching, they were recording. Phones rose at various angles, the glint of their screens catching the sunlight, and Marcus could feel the presence of those digital eyes capturing every detail. Edith's voice cracked as she pleaded again for Miller to stop, but her words were brushed aside like leaves in the wind. Miller's grip on Marcus's arm was firm, almost punishing, as he guided him toward the patrol car. "You're under arrest for interfering with an officer and causing a public disturbance," Miller declared loudly enough for the bystanders to hear, his tone more for them than for Marcus. "You people think you can just step in, stir things up and walk away without consequences." The phrase wasn't shouted, but it was laced with venom, and Marcus knew exactly what "you people" was meant to imply. Marcus kept his face calm, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to give Miller the satisfaction of reaction. Yet inside, the sting of those words burned hotter than the cuffs cutting into his wrists. The back door of the patrol car opened with a dull creak, and Miller guided Marcus down into the seat. The smell of vinyl and disinfectant hit him first, followed by the faint trace of sweat and old coffee that seemed to live in every cruiser he'd ever been in during his career, though never from this side of the door. The door shut with a heavy thud, the outside world replaced by the closed, stale air inside the vehicle. Through the glass he could see Edith standing there, her hands clasped to her chest, her face pale and drawn. She wasn't alone. The dog-walking couple was speaking urgently to another neighbor who had appeared, gesturing toward their phones. Marcus couldn't hear them, but he could read the determination in their faces. Miller slid into the driver's seat, his movements brisk and mechanical. The engine roared to life, and the patrol car pulled away from the curb. Almost immediately Miller began speaking, his voice calm but laced with a self-righteous edge. "You could have avoided all this if you just minded your own business. But no, you had to play the hero. People like you are always looking for trouble." Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting Miller's reflection in the rearview mirror. "People like me?" he asked, his tone controlled even. Miller smirked faintly, eyes still on the road. "Yeah, you know exactly what I mean. Always thinking the rules don't apply, always questioning authority." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. There was no point in explaining to this man that he had spent his entire life upholding rules, often at great personal cost, or that he understood authority better than most. Miller took his silence as an admission of guilt, continuing his monologue. You know, most folks would have walked away, let me handle my business, but no, you had to make it about you. Now you'll spend a little time cooling off, maybe think twice next time. Outside the window, the streets of Brooksville passed by, familiar sidewalks, neatly trimmed hedges and storefronts Marcus had walked past countless times. Each one now felt distant, framed by the narrow rectangle of glass, as though he were already separated from the world he knew. The ride to the station was short, but it stretched on in the heavy quiet between Miller's pointed remarks. Marcus's eyes stayed on the horizon, his breathing steady, though every word from the front seat pressed against the restraint he held over his own anger. When the car finally pulled into the small parking lot of the Brooksville Police Department, Marcus caught sight of the building's gray facade. It was unremarkable, functional brickwork, a faded flag stirring gently in the breeze, but to Marcus, it felt colder than any holding cell. The door opened and Miller's hand was back on his arm, guiding him toward the entrance. The cuffs bit again as Marcus stepped inside, the bright morning light replaced by the dim sterile glow of fluorescent bulbs. The lobby smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and the low hum of a vending machine filled the silence. A receptionist glanced up, her eyes flicking from Marcus's face to the cuffs at his wrists, then back to Miller with a hint of confusion. Without slowing, Miller led Marcus down a narrow hallway into the processing area. The walls here were painted a dull gray, their color doing nothing to hide the scuff marks and faint stains that spoke of years of similar scenes. The air felt heavier, cooler, as though the building itself was designed to press down on anyone who entered. In the holding room, a single bench was bolted to the wall. Miller guided Marcus to it, the cuffs still tight. "Sit," he ordered, his voice flat. Marcus sat down, the bench's cold metal seeping through his clothes. The room was empty except for a small desk in the corner where another officer sat, filling out paperwork. Miller began relaying his version of events, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who expected his word to be accepted without question. Marcus listened in silence, his gaze fixed on a crack in the wall. Every detail Miller spoke was twisted to fit his narrative. Marcus had been aggressive, uncooperative, a potential threat. The other officer nodded occasionally, jotting notes without looking up. Outside these walls, Marcus imagined Edith standing in her kitchen, phone in hand, replaying the video she, or perhaps one of the neighbors, had taken. He pictured her calling the Hendersons, the dog-walking couple, anyone she trusted to share it. He could almost hear her voice, thin but resolute, insisting that what had happened was wrong, that people needed to see. In that moment, Marcus understood that this wasn't just about him. It was about the pattern he had seen too many times before, authority used as a shield for arrogance, rules bent to suit the one holding the power. He had fought it in courtrooms and in the field, and now, apparently, he would have to fight it here. Miller stepped away from the desk, removing the cuffs with a quick twist, the marks they left on Marcus's wrists a faint but telling reminder. "You sit tight," Miller said, his tone carrying an unspoken warning. Marcus didn't respond. He sat still, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes steady on the doorway. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was wait and let the truth find its way into the light. And in Brooksville, on this late autumn morning, the light was already starting to gather outside these gray walls. The door to the holding area opened with a firm push, the hinges giving a low groan as a tall figure stepped inside. The room, already cool with its gray walls and fluorescent lights, seemed to still even more. Sheriff Daniel Harper, in his early 50s, moved with the easy authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His uniform was impeccably pressed, the silver badge on his chest catching the overhead light with every step. He scanned the room quickly, the desk officer, Miller standing stiffly by the wall, and then Marcus, sitting calmly on the cold metal bench. Harper's eyes landed on Marcus, and something in his expression shifted. At first, there was recognition, then disbelief, and finally, a sharp clarity that seemed to cut straight through the tension hanging in the air. Marcus Johnson. His voice was quieter than expected, almost reverent, but it carried across the room like the low roll of distant thunder. Miller straightened, his mouth opening as if to explain, but Harper didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on Marcus, his mind clearly replaying something from another time, another life. Marcus lifted his head slightly, meeting Harper's eyes with a calm that had been forged in years of staring down men in worse situations. "It's been a long time, Daniel," he said evenly. "About 20 years, if I'm counting right." Harper's jaw tightened as the memories fell into place. 20 years ago, an undercover sting gone wrong, a warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit, and a rookie detective named Daniel Harper bleeding out from a gunshot wound while chaos erupted around him. Marcus Johnson, then the FBI's field director, had been the one to pull him to safety, to get him medical attention in those critical minutes when every second had mattered. Without Marcus, Harper knew, he wouldn't be standing here now. Harper's voice hardened, though it wasn't directed at Marcus. "Get those cuffs off him, now." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand twitching at his belt, before moving toward Marcus with the key. The click of the cuffs unlocking echoed in the quiet room, a sound sharper than it had been when they closed. Marcus rubbed his wrists briefly, the faint red marks standing out against his skin, but he didn't look at Miller. Harper stepped closer, his presence filling the space. "I am so sorry, Marcus," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If I'd known you were here, this would never have happened. You should have been treated with respect from the moment you walked in." His words hung in the air, heavy with authority, and the desk officer looked down at his paperwork, clearly uncomfortable. Miller shifted on his feet, his jaw tight, but Harper wasn't finished. He turned slowly to face Miller, his eyes narrowing. "Explain to me," Harper began, his tone measured but dangerous, "why you brought Mr. Johnson in here in handcuffs over a spilled bag of trash." Miller's mouth opened again, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "He interfered with my duties, sir." The woman was refusing to comply, and he stepped in, became confrontational. Harper took a slow step toward him, closing the distance until they stood just a few feet. "Interfered?" he repeated, the word sharp. "You mean he asked you to show a 78-year-old woman some basic human decency, and you call that interference?" Miller's eyes flickered with something defiance, perhaps, but also the first hint of uncertainty. Harper's gaze didn't waver. "I know your training, Miller. I know exactly what's in the manual. Threatening to haul an elderly woman to the station over a mistake, demanding she pick up garbage with her bare hands, and then arresting a bystander who questions you. That's not procedure, that's ego." The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. The other officer behind the desk had stopped writing entirely, his eyes darting between the two men. Harper's voice grew colder. "And let's not pretend there wasn't something else in your tone when you spoke to him. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize it. You saw a black man standing up for someone, and you decided he was a threat. Am I wrong?" Miller's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. That silence was enough. Harper straightened, his decision made. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty, pending a full internal investigation into your conduct this morning. Turn in your badge and sidearm." The words landed like a gavel. Miller's face flushed, his mouth opening in protest. "Sir, with all due respect, don't." Harper cut him off, his voice suddenly sharp. "You've already disrespected enough for one day. Badge and gun, now." With stiff movements, Miller unfastened the badge from his chest and placed it on the desk, followed by his service weapon. The sound of each item hitting the surface was final, carrying more weight than the objects themselves. Harper didn't watch him leave. Instead, he turned back to Marcus, his expression softening. "Let's get you out of here," he said, gesturing toward the door. "I'd like to talk with you in my office, away from all this." Marcus rose from the bench, his height still commanding even without the presence of authority behind him. As they walked out together, the room seemed to exhale, the tension breaking just enough for the others to move again. But the echo of Harper's words, the sight of Miller stripped of his badge, would linger. In the hallway, Harper spoke quietly. "You saved my life once, I won't forget it, and I won't let something like this happen in my department without consequences." Marcus gave a single nod, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding a flicker of something, perhaps not satisfaction, but the quiet acknowledgement that justice, at least in this moment, had found its footing. Behind them the gray walls of the holding area stood unchanged, but the balance of power inside had shifted entirely. And for the first time since the cuffs had closed around his wrists, Marcus felt the air ease in his chest. The late afternoon sun spilled through the wide living room windows, casting warm golden light across the soft rug and the shelves lined with books, framed photographs, and mementos from a life lived in service. Marcus sat back in his armchair, the quiet hum of the neighborhood drifting in through the slightly open window, the distant laughter of children, the rhythmic creak of a porch swing, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It had been 3 days since the incident at the station, and the world outside had not stopped talking about it. The video, filmed from 2 different angles, had made its way from local community pages to national news feeds. People he had never met were sending letters, emails, and messages through neighbors, thanking him for stepping in that morning. Some wrote about their own experiences with injustice, others simply wanted him to know that his courage had meant something to them. His phone had rung more in the past 72 hours than it had in months, but Marcus answered only when he felt the conversation might carry meaning, not just curiosity. Across the country, voices rose in criticism of Officer Miller's behavior, and in praise of the quiet strength Marcus had shown. In Brooksville, it seemed everyone knew someone who knew someone in that video. Some stopped by his gate to offer a handshake or a word of thanks, their faces lit with respect. He accepted their gratitude with humility, though he never forgot that what he had done should not have been extraordinary, it should have been the way anyone acted. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He rose and crossed the living room, the wooden floor warm beneath his feet. When he opened the door, Edith Brown stood there, her small frame wrapped in a light cardigan despite the mild weather. In her hands was a round tin, its lid slightly dented but polished clean. "I baked something for you," she said, her voice carrying that mix of shyness and determination. Marcus smiled and stepped aside to let her in. "You didn't have to do that, Edith," he said as she moved slowly into the room. She gave a small laugh. "I wanted to. It's not every day someone stands up for an old woman who can't even carry her trash properly." Her tone was light, but her eyes glistened as she set the tin down on the coffee table. Marcus sat down on the sofa opposite her as she settled into the armchair. For a moment, they sat quietly, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and apples escaping from the tin. Edith folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with a sincerity that seemed to strip away all pretense. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she said softly. "But I do know this, you reminded me, and maybe everyone who's seen that video, that decency still exists, that there are still people who believe in doing what's right, even when it's hard." Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Edith," he began, his voice steady but warm, "justice isn't just something that happens in a courtroom, or in a headline. It lives in the choices we make every day, in the way we treat each other, especially when no one is watching. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. And I couldn't walk by and let it happen." She nodded, her smile faint but full of understanding. "I know, and I'm grateful." He opened the tin, revealing a perfectly baked apple pie, the crust golden and dusted with sugar. "Looks like you've given me something worth protecting too," he said with a hint of humor. She laughed, the sound light and genuine, and for a moment, the heaviness of the past days seemed to lift. Marcus rose to pour them both cups of tea from the kettle on the side table, the steam curling into the air as he placed one gently in front of her. They sat together, sipping in companionable silence, the pie between them, the sunlight shifting slowly across the room as the day inched toward evening. Outside, Brooksville went about its quiet routines, but inside Marcus's home, there was a rare kind of peace, one born from knowing that in a small corner of the world, a wrong had been righted, and the ripples of that moment were still moving outward. As the last of the light caught in Edith's silver hair, and the warm scent of apple filled the air, Marcus felt a deep quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. Not pride in himself, but pride in what could still be possible between people. He looked across at Edith, her hands wrapped around the warm teacup, her gaze calm now, free of the fear he had seen that morning at the trash bins. And in that stillness, the truth of his own words lingered. Justice was not only in the law, but in the small human acts that reminded the world what it could be.